right. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so honored to be a part of such a distinguished panel. I'm going to talk primarily about the legal responsibility of psychopaths today. I'm going to focus on whether they have capacity responsibility in the sense in which HLA Hart talks about capacity responsibility. I'm going to explore two cognitive deficits, affective deficits and volitional or self-control deficits that may impact their capacity responsibility. I'm going to ask the question whether psychopaths as a group suffer from cognitive deficits such that a diagnosis of psychopathy can be considered exculpatory before a court. And if I have time, which I may not, sorry, should I speak up? If I have time, hopefully I'll get to the question of psychopaths' moral responsibility. I think the questions of their legal responsibility and their moral responsibility actually come apart in an interesting way. So let me say a few things about capacity responsibility. Hart argued that capacity responsibility was a precondition for legal liability responsibility. So almost before we get to the question of whether a defendant could form a culpable mental state, mens rea, we need to ask what sort of agent that person is and what their general capacities for understanding and decision-making are. So Hart argued that capacity responsibility consists in understanding, reasoning, and control of conduct, the ability to understand what conduct legal and moral rules require, to deliberate and reach decisions concerning these requirements, and to conform to decisions when made. He argued that these capacities could be diminished so that one might be excused via diminished mental capacity, or wholly missing, which might be the case with certain people with a very serious mental illness, and who are found properly not guilty by reason of legal insanity. Another class of defendants that we think might have lack capacity responsibility altogether are very young children. So in America, we have a hard time determining where that line is, where a child might develop full capacity responsibility, but it certainly seems in this case that the arrest of an 8-year-old for the murder of a 1.5-year-old was incorrect. Right? Even though that 8-year-old said, I wanted to kill him, the child that was screaming that the 8-year-old ended up kicking to death, that child doesn't have full capacity responsibility, right? That child doesn't understand the nature of legal and moral rules and can't conform his behavior to those rules. So the question regarding psychopaths' capacity responsibility is whether there are, it looks like there's some weirdness in my slide. I'll have to kind of tell you what that says. There are two possible deficits, cognitive deficits associated with psychopathy that could result in a lack of capacity responsibility or diminished capacity responsibility. Affective deficits, including shallow affect, a lack of empathy, and deficits associated with self-control. Some argue that a psychopath's lack of emotional data might result in a lack of moral knowledge, so that psychopaths don't understand legal and moral rules in a normal sort of way. And others have argued that psychopaths' impulsivity, heightened risk-taking, poor behavioral control would indicate that they can't actually be law-abiding, that they can't make decisions such that they can follow laws. So I'm going to start with the first possibility, that psychopaths lack legal or moral knowledge. There's been a ton of research on this question. I'm going to have to move through some of it quite quickly. There's been a lot of research that psychopaths might have a failure of the moral circuit, as indicated by reduced amygdala volume or reduced amygdala activity, as Adrian was indicating earlier. There's some evidence that behavioral evidence that psychopaths are not good at detecting emotions in other people or in emotions on their faces, for example. They exhibit poor recognition of fear and sadness in faces. And philosophers and some other scholars have argued that these sorts of affective deficits might be related to an inability on the part of psychopaths to distinguish between moral rules and conventional rules, such that they don't kind of feel the pull of moral rules in a normal way. And the way that this has been discussed in the literature and tested to some extent is to argue that psychopaths can't understand the distinction between moral and conventional rules using this particular sort of task. We can imagine the task in this way. If a substitute teacher comes into a classroom and says, I know ordinarily you're not allowed to hit each other, but today I've decided that that rule is out the window and you can start hitting each other. Go ahead and hit your neighbor. We imagine that students in that classroom would hopefully pause. They wouldn't immediately start hitting each other because they would have a sense that that rule against hitting was not contingent on authority, right? That it was still wrong to hit their neighbor even if the substitute teacher says it's okay. Other sorts of rules about using notes on an exam or chewing gum in the classroom, however, would seem to be contingent on someone giving permission, right? If the substitute teacher says it's okay for you to chew gum or to use notes on the exam, that we feel that those students might feel more all right with following that rule and throwing out the old rule. So there was a study that indicated that psychopaths did have a hard time kind of distinguishing to some extent between moral and conventional transgressions. But the interesting thing about this study was that psychopaths didn't decide that kind of moral transgressions were contingent on authority. The opposite was found in this case. So psychopaths actually deemed all the kind of normative transgressions that were described as not contingent on authority, as absolute. And further studies indicated that there was something especially interesting happening here. So Synod Armstrong and Kent Keel and Eyal Aroni did a study where they asked the psychopaths very specifically to label a transgression as moral or conventional. And psychopaths could do that just as well as anyone else, as the control group. And instead, the variation in the ability to do this was contingent on IQ and not on affect or kind of affective levels. And it turns out that there's some other evidence that psychopaths and affect is kind of an interesting and complicated question. When we group psychopaths into these different designations, you have different subsets with kind of different abilities with regard to affect. So primary psychopaths were kind of notoriously associated with flattened affect, with a lack of empathy, but secondary psychopathy is associated with heightened affect, negative emotionality in particular, and reactive aggression. And when we carve psychopaths up into this other group, unsuccessful psychopaths, which are those that tend to get caught up in the criminal justice system, versus successful psychopaths that seem to have the capacity to avoid being caught up in the criminal justice system. These are the psychopaths among us, right, that might be the CEO of a large company. The unsuccessful psychopaths seem to have problems with affect and reduced amygdala volume, reduced autonomic levels. But the successful psychopaths, who are again diagnosed as having psychopathy using the PCLR usually, do not have such problems with affect. They seem to have intact and in some cases maybe even enhanced autonomic levels. And some further research muddies the waters even more. So it looks like even those psychopaths who have affective deficits might be able to correct for some of those deficits with attentional control. So one review indicated that psychopaths, if you could direct their attention to particular fear-inducing cues, they would generate the right amount of affect. They just didn't notice the cues like a normal person. And psychopaths were kind of notoriously bad on gambling tasks because it seems that they didn't feel bad about losing lots of money in high risk taking. But when you directed their attention with regard to the gambling task, they also performed in a way equivalent to the control group. So kind of taking all of this together, it seems that many psychopaths, or at least psychopaths, again, as diagnosed using the PCLR in particular, may not have affective deficits, and those that do may, in some cases, be able to correct for those deficits. In addition, psychopaths can understand the normative force of rules, and they can recognize moral rules as such. At least some of the recent studies indicate this. So it doesn't seem that a high score on the PCLR should indicate to the court, especially, a lack of capacity responsibility due to a lack of moral knowledge. So let's turn to the other possibility, a lack of self-control. Most people would argue that the capacity for self-control in the sense that the law is interested is grounded within what we call executive functions. This is not an exhaustive or necessarily authoritative list. There's lots of discussion about what counts as an executive function and how we should classify them and to what extent they come apart. But most cognitive scientists would agree that this is a reasonable list. And these do seem to be capacities that are necessary for behavioral control. My colleague, Bill Herstein, and I argued in a neuroethics article that when you look at successful psychopaths, again, those ones that tend to avoid getting caught up in the criminal justice system, they seem to have intact executive functions, and thus they can exhibit volitional control, and they may even be able to correct for any affective deficits using kind of attentional control and other means. We argued, however, that unsuccessful psychopaths may have executive deficits. They may have diminished executive functioning, and thus if they also then have affective deficits, they may not be able to correct for them, and they may lack kind of the self-control to be fully culpable under the law. However, in an article in the same journal just a couple of years later, Georgieko and Malatesti, who are a couple researchers who are focusing specifically on psychopathy and have generated a huge amount of work in the last couple of years, argued that when you look really closely at the most recent data on unsuccessful psychopaths and executive function, they do not think that as a group, unsuccessful psychopaths have diminished executive functioning such that they are less culpable under the law. So they agreed with us that executive functions were super important, right, to having capacity, responsibility under the law, and specifically self-control. But they argued that we needed to differentiate between hot EFs and cool EFs. Hot executive functions are those that tend to be engaged when you're doing a task that involves emotions. Cool EFs tend to be executive functions that don't necessarily trade in affect or utilize emotion. Cool EFs are often tested by the Wisconsin card sorting test, if that is familiar with anyone. Hot EFs are sometimes tested with the gambling task. What they argued is that you do see some diminishment in hot EFs in unsuccessful psychopaths, but that they tend to have normal cool EFs such that they can correct for the deficits in hot EFs using, again, it seems, attentional control and normal cool executive functions. So they argued that there isn't sufficient evidence indicating that psychopaths suffer from general impairments as a group, psychopaths underlying control capacities. And I'm on the fence. I think there's still a lot of data being generated on this question. However, I have come to believe that, again, especially as diagnosed on the PCLR, the group psychopath is an incredibly heterogeneous group. And they seem to be heterogeneous with regard to the things that really matter to legal culpability. So I'm arguing in a paper that's under review that I wrote with Annalee Jefferson, who's at the University of Birmingham, that the group psychopath is heterogeneous such that a diagnosis of psychopathy is at best an indicator to the court that further psychological testing might be required to indicate an excuse. And maybe what the court should be looking for, again, are those cool EFs that seem to really matter to self-control. Okay, so just to kind of highlight the points that I've made so far, I want to very quickly discuss a case where neuroscientific evidence with regard to psychopathy was actually introduced in a court case, and I think it was wrongfully introduced. That is, it really shouldn't have been taken into consideration by the court, or it shouldn't have been considered relevant. This is the case of Brian Dugan. Many of you may have heard of this case. It's a case from the state where I reside, an Illinois case. Dugan was already serving a life in prison without the possibility of parole sentence for an earlier murder. He was a serial rapist and murderer. When DNA evidence linked him to yet another crime from 1983, the rape and murder of a 10-year-old. He was found guilty at the trial phase of capital murder. We still had capital murder at the time. And at the sentencing phase, evidence was introduced of his psychopathy as evidence of his diminished capacity such that he shouldn't be eligible for capital murder. His score on the PCLR was very high, a 38. which is extraordinarily high. But you have to keep in mind, of course, this score was generated on the Dugan at the time of this capital murder case, right? We don't know what his score on the PCLR was at the time that he committed the murder in 1983. And Kent Keel was presented by the defense to talk about fMRI results indicating that he had reduced amygdala volume, right? And kind of evidence that he had problems with his emotional circuit, right? There was reduced activity and reduced volume. And it seems to me that even assuming that the fMRI evidence generated by Kent Keel could be taken to show that Dugan had affective deficits at the time of the crime in 1983, which is a stretch in and of itself, there wasn't really any evidence that was presented with regard to Dugan's executive functioning. And so it's not clear whether that the affective lack, again, assuming it could have been proven, could have been corrected for, or the way in which that affective lack might have interacted with something like his executive functions. So my current position really is that a diagnosis of psychopathy is not a reliable indication of diminished capacity responsibility or the appropriateness of a legal excuse. And a lot of that may have to do with the sort of diagnostic that we're using in order to determine that someone is a psychopath. In the law, it tends to be the PCLR in particular. Very quickly before I finish, so I've made an argument that psychopaths may be legally responsible, they may not be eligible for an excuse, but I think that the standard for moral responsibility might be different. And it may be the case that psychopaths are a group where those two come apart in a kind of interesting way. So criminal responsibility seems to rest on the ability to understand legal rules and to act in accordance with these rules. But moral responsibility may involve higher demands that the person not just recognize moral rules as such or understand kind of normative demands in general, but that a person be sensitive to specifically moral reasons, not just prudential ones, and sensitive consistently over time, depending on the theory of moral responsibility that you're using. So I tend to be sympathetic to the Fisher-Revisa view that in order for a person to be fully morally culpable, they have to be regularly receptive to a range of reasons, including moral reasons, such that the person manifests an intelligible pattern of responsiveness over time from a third-person perspective. It seems to me that many psychopaths would not be able to meet these demands, right? You're not going to see them sensitive to moral reasons in a regular way over time. This may mean that they're not fully morally culpable, even though they might be legally responsible. And I think that has interesting ramifications for their punishment, but I won't go into that because I don't have time right now, and I think Stephen's going to get into the punishment of psychopaths. Thank you.